the operators in Europe saw that it was technically possible to do attacks that caused blackouts, and also there were parties that were preparing for this. So I think that really helped to, as a wake-up call, to make sure that people are aware that this could happen.
For years already, experts around the world have been warning of cyber attacks in utilities and power grids. Take, for example, the attacks on wind power companies in northern Germany a year ago, which showed how quickly malware can paralyze parts of our energy system. German authorities also happen to be on the trail of a hacker group that is specifically spying on power grids. And there are so many points of attack, from the growing number of PV and wind power installations to battery storage and charging systems up to smart meters. So high time we address this topic head on. Brace yourselves for the potential dangers of cyber attacks and how we can make our energy system more secure. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. As the expert for this episode, I'm very happy to welcome Maarten Hoeve. He was the Director Technology at ENCS, which stands for European Network for Cybersecurity, a non-profit organization owned by grid operators, so DSOs and TSOs, that want to improve cybersecurity and make sure that all the relevant stakeholders are communicating together. So, welcome, Maarten. Awesome to have you on the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm very good, thank you.
It's really a pleasure to have you on the podcast because in my experience, cybersecurity specifically in the context of power grids is always like a hush-hush topic. Nobody actually ever wants to talk about it, especially not on stage. Why is that?
I don't know. I mean, it's always difficult to talk about vulnerabilities or risks. So I think that this is, people rather not talk about it just to make sure that also the people that shouldn't know about it, the hackers and the people that want to damage, know about this. So I think we are quite sensitive as a community to make sure that we don't tell anything that would help make an attack easier. I think that's sort of the hesitation that many people in the field have to talk about it.
That's a fair point then, which of course makes it much more valuable to have the ENCS sort of as then a quiet organization in the background where people can meet and actually discuss the topic. Now, we have some suspected spy balloons in the air. We heard about Russian ships sailing between wind farms in the North Sea. There's constant reports of cyber attacks on companies and authorities in any industry, basically. Is the situation currently, and also probably due to the Russian attack on Ukraine, increasing? Are there more threats, or have we simply become more sensitive to them? What's your current status quo to the threat level on our supply system?
Yeah, I mean, and clearly something has changed. I mean, we have a major war now in Europe, which we haven't had really since World War II, and you see it really changing all the international relations, both between the West and Russia, but also between the West and China. So a lot of things are happening, and that clearly increases the interest of parties to harm countries in Europe. Also, clearly, energy is sort of a battlefield within the whole Ukraine war. I mean, in the whole strategic bombing campaign in Ukraine, Russia is specifically targeting the electricity grid. And also internationally, I mean, you see electricity prices being used as a weapon. There have been incidents, as you mentioned, on the North Sea with Russian ships investigating wind parks. There have been Nord Stream 2 explosions. So clearly, energy is this battlefield, electricity also. So we should be alert for attacks. On the other hand, I think cyber attacks have been less prominent than we expected. They've played less of a role than many have expected. I mean, we've had many incidents in Ukraine, cyber incidents specifically, since 2014. For the electricity sector, specifically the attacks on DSOs in 2015 and DSOs and TSOs in 2016. And I think back then the idea was this is sort of a dress rehearsal. Russia is testing their capabilities so that if there's a major conflict, they can use these capabilities that they've developed. So I think most people's expectations, certainly my expectation, was that when the war started, that we would have major cyber incidents also involving electricity companies. And that hasn't happened yet so far as we know. I mean, there have been definitely incidents. Certainly at the start, there was the major incident with the Viasat satellite communication. I think in April they found this Indestroyer malware that was developed in 2016. It was indeed used. But there hasn't been a lot of evidence that these cyber attacks have caused major problems for Ukraine. And I think the big question is what this means. I mean, is the case that Ukraine has a really strong defense, and should we just be looking at what they're doing and copy it so that we are also safe in the future? Or maybe Russian capabilities are not as great as expected, or they didn't have enough time to prepare. So we really don't understand yet what's going on and what this really would mean for the cybersecurity risk for the electricity system.
Imagining that a player such as Russia actually would have the capabilities, how high do you assess the risk of really a blackout due to a cyber attack?
Yes, I think for risk it's important to need to look at risk as the likelihood times the impact. And as I said before, the likelihood is very difficult to assess. I mean, my impression still is if you have a really motivated nation-state attacker or maybe a really skilled criminal group, they would have the technical capability to do it. So then the likelihood really depends on their motivation, which is very hard to assess. But I think the most important thing is the impact. If something would happen, this would have a very large impact. I mean, cyber attacks are different than normal blackouts in that sort of they're not limited by the physical world. So if you would have a malware, for instance, spreading very fast, that could spread to a lot of electricity companies quickly and then cause very big blackouts. And I think the bigger the blackouts gets, the more difficult also gets to recover from this. We're getting more dependent also for managing the electricity grid for on digital systems. So it can be both quite large and quite long. I mean, in the 2015-2016 attacks in Ukraine, you already saw reasonably big blackouts, even with relatively simple attack. But they could recover quite quickly by going to manual operation of the grid. And I think in the Western world, in Europe, we are not capable or less and less capable of going to this manual control. We were getting more and more reliant on digital systems. So you may also get longer effect. And so the impact can be quite big. And even if you estimate the likelihood is quite low, the risk can still be quite considerable.
Just a quick question before we move on. Do you think, of course, state actors could have an interest in attacking the power grid. Do you think that non-state actors are hesitant to go there because also, if you attack private companies and their cloud infrastructure, for example, you don't have its state coming after you afterwards. So it's just also the risk bigger for attackers if they go into a national power grid, and that's why they shy away from it?
Yeah, that does indeed seems to be a reason. Although, I mean, we've already seen a trend, for instance, from ransomware going first for attacking consumers. They are moving to bigger companies. But I think generally, I mean, indeed, if there were attacks like the Colonial Pipeline that really affect critical infrastructure, you saw a very strong government reaction to try to protect this, and that poses a risk to attackers. On the other hand, also the changing political situation may change that. I mean, if I'm now a sort of a criminal hacker group in Russia, I may not care that much about how Western governments react to this. So it's a bit unpredictable also how this will develop. But at the moment, I would estimate the risk coming from, say, criminal activity is lower as from the nation-state side.
So you said it's a mixed situation. There's more an incentive for certain actors to move. Surprisingly, it hasn't happened yet. If it were to happen, what are the most critical points specifically in the power grid? And also, if you look at the entire renewable energy systems, what are the weakest links in the chain?
Yeah. I think traditionally we've been really concerned with so-called operational technology. So the systems that are directly controlling the electricity grid or the bigger power plants. So that would be SCADA systems that control centers use to remotely control systems, equipment at substations, I think more recently smart meters. I mean, there's a lot of concern about these systems because they use a lot of legacy equipment. So they are in a way quite vulnerable. But we've seen the past few years actually that the security has been greatly improved. I think what people mainly have been doing is to separate these equipment from other networks. So they've sort of built in firewalls, other systems between these systems and enterprise IT system, internet. So these systems are sort of buffered. They're not directly connected to the outside world. And I think that has greatly reduced the risk of attacks on this. I think it would be quite difficult at the moment for attackers to reach these kind of systems, especially at the bigger grid operators or suppliers. I think the new critical point that is sort of emerging is more the decentralized side. So the smaller solar and wind farms, the smaller generation consumer equipment. I mean, you have a lot of solar inverters, heat pumps, EV chargers that are connected to the internet. And I think the amount of power that's being controlled by the system is increasing very quickly with the energy transition. So you get more and more being controlled through these smaller parties. And at the moment, this is not really seen as critical infrastructure. So it's very clear that if I have a big transmission system operator, distribution system operator, SCADA system is critical infrastructure, you have to have the highest level of security. But if I have like a home EV charger or solar inverter, I mean, this is not seen as really critical infrastructure because it's just, I mean, if something happens, the impact is quite small. But of course, taken together, they are becoming quite critical. And I think one of the challenges is that typically consumers or small businesses, they don't have the resources to really implement the strong security measures that larger grid operators, for instance, have implemented the past years. I mean, how many consumers will actually be applying security patches to their home solar inverter or to their home charging station? I think no one's doing this, and this is creating a bigger risk factor.
But is it actually the responsibility of the consumer to look after these patches, or wouldn't it be the responsibility of the system provider to automatically patch security issues?
Well, I think this is indeed one of the interesting questions, and I think that's where we now at least see regulation coming, specifically, for instance, the Cybersecurity Act that the European Commission is working on that will make it a responsibility of suppliers to at least provide patches, so to develop patches if there's a vulnerability. But I think at the moment it's a bit in the middle who's responsible, and that's also creating some of the risk that no one really feels responsible at the moment for doing patches to some of these systems.
I mean, it just, if I hand over my used iPhone to my mom, she always has troubles finding her way through the newest model. I can't imagine her looking after the security patch of their PV system that they actually have on the rooftop.
No, indeed. So I think that's not a workable model. So we have to have a new model for this. And I mean, there's probably parties that do take this responsibility. I mean, providers of solar inverters. But I think it's not like a legal responsibility. So there are also parties that are not taking this responsibility, and that creates, I think a big risk, because indeed, there's a lot of people that are not aware that they should be doing anything about security about their home equipment.
We talked a lot about the increasing threat risk due to, on the one hand, digitalization. You mentioned, for example, smart meters. You also mentioned heat pumps connected to the internet. You mentioned the decentralized small wind farms. Is there also an upside to having a more decentralized system, to have smart grids and decentralized power generation? Is that an opportunity to improve security as well?
I think so. I mean, the decentralization always has sort of two effects on risk. I mean, as it says, the risk is sort of likelihood times impact. If you have decentralization, typically it increases the likelihood because of the smaller parties cannot take the same security measures. I mean, you at home cannot have the same security on your solar inverter than, as a big transmission system operator has for the SCADA system, or big power suppliers for the big power plant. So the likelihood that, say, a solar inverter would be compromised is bigger. On the other hand, the impact would be lower because you have more smaller things and possibly some more variation. So if there is an incident, it won't have that big of an impact. So it's always difficult to sort of see what's the net effect. Will the effect on the likelihood be bigger or on the impact be bigger? So that's a bit hard to predict. But I think in this case, the risk is increasing because there's sort of hidden centralization in the decentralization. So all of these decentral resources are typically still being controlled from one central point. I mean, if I have a home solar inverter, often it will just sort of connect back to a server of the manufacturer. Or if I have a charging station, there will be some charge point operator maintaining this. And that would mean if these central systems somehow get compromised, then you cannot directly affect all of the connected solar inverters or charging stations or whatever is done. So it looks from an electricity grid, it looks decentralized. But in practice, from the IT side, it's actually quite centralized. And I think if we are very careful in finding these sort of central points, these single points of failures, then we are in trouble.
Oh, that's a very fair point, the hidden centralization. I can totally imagine that just when it comes to payment services, it's rather likely that in the end, even if that probably your heat pump provider operates on the same, somewhere in the background on the same payment service as does your charging system, etc. Because usually they all somehow use the same white label IT infrastructure, I suppose, or the same mid layer or the same platform to actually pool their data and exchange information.
Indeed, or maybe they're on the same cloud provider, all of them. And if the cloud provider has problems, then all of them are not reachable. So, I mean, there are some hidden points where they're using the same providers, the same IT infrastructure, the same components that make them more vulnerable in a way.
So apart from also the home aspect, let's maybe zoom out and look more on the grid operator level again and on the energy supplier level. How are they positioned in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, I think at the moment they're positioned quite well. We had the 2015 and 2016 attacks in Ukraine on TSOs and DSOs. And I think that really helped to raise awareness. I mean, the operators in Europe saw that it was technically possible to do attacks that caused blackouts, and also there were parties that were preparing for this. So I think that really helped as a wake-up call to make sure that people are aware that this could happen. And then shortly after, we got the NAS directive, the European Critical Infrastructure Regulation, and that really helped to also make financial resources available for fixing security. Because I mean, if it's a legal requirement to do something about cybersecurity, then you have to free up the financial resource also for this. So we have seen quite a lot of improvements over the past, say, 5 years. And I think generally the big problems are being fixed. I think the most difficult point is the shortage of skilled personnel. I mean, I think generally in security, it's difficult to get staff with the right expertise. And for some of the critical systems, I mean, they have used very specific technology like SCADA systems. They are very specific, and you cannot just get someone from IT security to be directly effective in this area. So you need to have people with specific knowledge about operational technology and the electricity sector to be effective. And we are quite short-staffed in that sense. I think there's enough personnel to address the major risk. I mean, people have been focusing on, for instance, protecting the SCADA system, protecting critical substations, and I think that really helped to bring down the overall risk level. But there's still a lot of sort of smaller risks that we would like to address. And I think one of the key challenges is to have more personnel available and to have sort of invest in training to make sure we have the right personnel also in the future.
So that's just, I guess, an issue that any industry is facing, hiring enough or finding enough developers and IT specialists. Now, just as a little side question, since you always mention the attacks in the Ukraine, as grim as it is, does it also provide an opportunity to actually learn how attacks are being exercised? And does it actually help to strengthen systems in Europe?
I think in part it depends on how much information we get. For instance, I think from the first attack in 2015, there was quite a good write-up of it. And I think that indeed really helped to improve security. I mean, I think every DSO or TSO I know looked at this report, compared to their own system, and sort of fixed the problems they saw in this report. So I think that was really helpful. But you saw, for instance, in the 2016 attack, there was much less information about what really happened. And if there's no information coming to operators, there's less to do. And I think also at the moment, we don't know exactly what's going on. So it's difficult to take lessons from this yet. I hope we will get more information in the future, but at the moment, it's still sort of in the fog of war, and we don't know exactly what's happening.
So we said already there's a shortage of skilled labor, which of course makes it difficult to address all the things that need to be done. But where should the priority lie? What can we do to reduce the risk of cyber attacks? What actions should we focus on? And how could we most effectively increase security?
Well, I think if you look again for grid operators and suppliers, so those are the bigger traditional companies, the first priority is this segregation of these operation technology systems. I mean, they're typically legacy systems, are difficult to keep up to date, and they often have direct control of very large amounts of power, large parts of the grid. So it's difficult to get the systems themselves of a high security level. So what you want to do is to segregate them from other systems, so from enterprise IT systems, from internet. And there you want to have firewalls between the systems, possible sort of demilitarized zones, that there is sort of a buffer zone between enterprise IT and these systems. And then also look at, are there any ways to bypass this? I mean, you see, for instance, sometimes that laptops are being used by engineers that sort of go past the firewalls that are connected to both types of systems. These kind of sort of backdoors into the OT systems also need to be protected. I think if you do that well, that really helps to keep out the most obvious attack that really makes it much more difficult to get in. And I think then the next step would be to make sure that you also have the capability to respond to attacks. So to set up a security operations center, a SOC, or maybe an incident response team. There's different names for this, but you want to have people that can sort of monitor what's happening, that can see what's happening in your system, and that also know what to do if something happens, so that can react to this. And I think that that's very important. I think The skill there is the most important, that you have a skilled team that really knows what to do. But besides that, you also have to have visibility. So you have to have systems that can monitor, for instance, network or get logs from the systems. And you have to think about, well, what do I do if something goes wrong? And then I think this is still one of the difficult questions. I mean, if something would happen like we saw in Ukraine, so there would be an incident, malware found in the substation, you need to start thinking about, what can I do? Because you cannot just shut down systems, so you have to have a plan of how to recover from this.
So having really a forward contingency plan is, I guess, key to any cyber attack strategy. And also, I suppose, as a non-expert, the most undervalued aspect of it, I suppose. I guess having the SOC set up and having a really thought through plan that actually gets executed once the attacks happen probably is not yet the standard.
No, I think there are always a few, the security people are thinking about this, but it's not enough to have the security experts working on this. If something goes wrong, you also want to have the substation engineers, the people responsible for the SCADA systems, to help you. And I think it's more difficult to have them think about this because it's such a different way of thinking. You're thinking of situations where someone is really intentionally trying to damage your systems. And that's very alien for people not working in security. I mean, if you ask a substation engineer, well, what if I want to do harm, what can I do? They look at you like, well, why would anyone want to do harm? That's very dangerous. Why would you do that? And I think this different mindset is important to also have in a larger part of the organization, not just in the small, like these 10 people working on security operations. You want to have all of your organization ready to respond to these incidents. And I think this is still something that we need to work on.
And I guess the ENCS comes in to raise awareness among stakeholders. How does the ENCS help grid operators and utilities to increase their security? What would not be possible if it wasn't for the existence of the ENCS?
Well, I think one thing that's very important is that we bring together the security experts from different organizations. So we're a member organization. We have 25 TSO and DSO members. And one of the things we do is to really make sure that they meet regularly and have the opportunity to talk to each other, because it's quite difficult for these people. I mean, they're usually very busy working on their own thing. And I think one of the values we bring is that we sort of bring them together, the people really into the security, and have them also exchange their experiences, because often they're struggling with the same problem. And if you have like 20 people in security in the room, usually if you have a problem, there's someone who already worked on this and may have a solution for this. And I think we're very effective in getting the right people together and helping them share their problems, but also the solutions to this.
And I guess having a very safe and confidential space is key to really sharing that kind of information and creating a pool of knowledge. Thanks a lot, Maarten, for having joined us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
For further information, visit EMpower Europe, the international exhibition for energy management and integrated energy solutions. It is focused on modernizing and digitalizing the power grid into a smart grid, as well as injecting flexibility and integrating prosumers, e-mobility, as well as power-to-heat concepts into a holistic, renewable energy system. Learn more online at em-power.eu.